Hello, my loyal royal friends and subjects. I have another tale to read. There are only 2 episodes left for this season, and while I already know what I want the last story to be, I had to find another one quickly for today's episode. I'm a little unorganized with this first season. I hope I can learn for the second season, and any other season from here on out. After searching on Professor D.L. Ashleman's website, I think I found one. Let me ask you something. Whenever you read a fairy tale with a princess in it, what word usually accompanies her? If you answered beautiful, then you'd be right. In almost every fairy tale I've ever read, whenever there is a princess, she is usually described as being the most beautiful maiden with no equal to her appearance. As for the princess's stepsister, the word that will usually accompany her is ugly. In fairy tales, physical beauty is meant to represent virtue, while physical ugliness represents evil. Granted, this idea might not be very well received in modern society. I mean, just look at all the hate that the Disney princesses get, simply because of how they and their villains are designed. I'll talk more about that later, but for now, you might be happy to hear that even in older fairy tales, this hasn't always been the case. It might be rare, but there are fairy tales in which the villains are very beautiful women, like the Queen from Snow White or the stepsisters in the Grimm's version of Cinderella. Yet, despite their beauty, they are by no means virtuous and even try to cause harm to the heroine, who may be more or even less beautiful than they are. The same thing can be applied to fairy tales about an ugly princess who ends up being the hero of the story. And I believe the best portrayal of this uncommon fairy tale trope would be ATU 711. This tale type is known as the beautiful and ugly twin sisters. Unfortunately, this is yet another fairy tale that I couldn't find much history on. In his book, The Folk Tale, our buddy Stith Thompson claims that this tale is popular in Norway and Iceland, yet seems to be unknown in other countries, while other sources claim the contrary, that the knowledge of this tale extends beyond Europe and may even reach to countries in Asia and the Americas. Despite this, it's another story that hasn't gained much recognition in the modern world. In fact, I could only find 3 available stories with this tale type. There might be more and I just couldn't find them, but I only found 3 literary sources that I could have chosen for this episode. Those stories are Tatterhood, Kate Crackernuts, and Ricky of the Tuft. I don't much care for the 3rd story, but as for the other 2, I had a hard time deciding which one I wanted to read for this episode. Seriously, I was racking my brains out and deciding. Both of these stories have something that I liked over the other, and vice versa. In the end, I realized that both of them were too short to read and would make this a 10-minute episode when I try to keep it to, say, 20 minutes to an hour. So you know what? I'm going to read both of them. Tatterhood and Kate Crackernuts belong to the same tale type, therefore, they have a lot of plot points in common. Yet they're also unique in their own way, and I hope you enjoy both of them. Our first story is Tatterhood, by Peter Christian Absjørnsen and Jørn Ingebretsen Moe, whose names I hope I pronounced a little better than last time. Yeah, let me know how I did. Anyway, Absjørnsen and Moe collected many Norwegian folk tales, and they recorded Tatterhood in their book, Popular Tales from the Norse. With that, let's go ahead and begin the story of Tatterhood. Once on a time there was a king and a queen who had no children, and that gave the queen much grief. She scarce had one happy hour. She was always bewailing and bemoaning herself, and saying how dull and lonesome it was in the palace. "If we had children, there'd be life enough," she said. Wherever she went in all her realm, she found God's blessing in children, even in the vilest hut. And wherever she came, she heard the goodies scolding the bairns, and saying how they had done that and that wrong. All this the queen heard, and thought it would be so nice to do as other women did. This isn't the first time we've come across a childless couple in a fairy tale with infertility problems. We've already read the story of Momotaro on this podcast, and as I've said in that episode, infertility is a common trope in most fairy tales. This might have been because of how it wasn't as treatable as it might be today. Not that there's a miracle cure for it in modern times. However, in this case, in which we have an infertile king and queen, the situation might be 10 times worse since they're royalty, and if they can't produce an heir, then that could potentially put an end to their royal bloodline. At last, the king and queen took into their palace a stranger lassie to rear up, that they might have her always with them, to love her if she did well, and scold her if she did wrong, like their own child. So one day the little lassie whom they had taken as their own ran down into the palace yard and was playing with a gold apple. Just then an old beggar wife came by, who had a little girl with her, and it wasn't long before the little lassie and the beggar's bairn were great friends, and began to play together, and to toss the gold apple about between them. It's interesting that there is a slight mention of a golden apple. Not only does this show how ridiculously wealthy the king and queen must be to have any type of golden fruit, but the most famous golden apples can be found in Greek mythology. There's the golden apple, which is created by Eris, and is said to belong to the prettiest goddess, an event that started a chain reaction that led to the Trojan War. The goddess Hera also possesses a tree that produces golden apples, and Aphrodite helps a young man named Hippomenes win the heart of Atalanta by tossing golden apples at her to beat her in a foot race. Yeah, I consider that cheating. Aside from that, there's also the poisoned apple in Snow White. So it's safe to say that, most of the time, an apple will represent chaos and misfortune in folk tales. So let's see what happens in this story. When the queen saw this, as she sat at a window in the palace, she tapped on the pane for her foster daughter to come up. She went at once, but the beggar girl went up too, and as they went into the queen's bower, each held the other by the hand. Then the queen began to scold the little lady and to say, "You ought to be above running about and playing with a tattered beggar's brat." And so she wanted to drive the lassie downstairs. "If the queen only knew my mother's power, she'd not drive me out," said the little lassie. And when the queen asked what she meant more plainly, she told her how her mother could get her children if she chose. The queen wouldn't believe it, but the lassie held her own, and said every word of it was true, and bade the queen only to try and make her mother do it. So the queen sent the lassie down to fetch up her mother. "Do you know what your daughter says?" asked the queen to the old woman, as soon as ever she came into the room. No, the beggar wife knew nothing about it. "Well, she says that you can get me children if you will," answered the queen. "Queens shouldn't listen to beggar lassies' silly stories," said the old wife, and strode out of the room. Then the queen got angry and wanted again to drive out the little lassie, but she declared it was true, every word that she had said. "Let the queen only give my mother a drop to drink," said the lassie. "When she gets merry, she'll soon find out a way to help you." The queen was ready to try this, so the beggar wife was fetched up again once more, and treated both with wine and mead as much as she chose. And so it was not long before her tongue began to wag. Then the queen came out again with the same question she had asked before. "One way to help you, perhaps I know," said the beggar wife. "Your Majesty must make them bring in 2 pails of water some evening before you go to bed. In each of them you must wash yourself, and afterwards throw away the water under the bed. When you look under the bed next morning, 2 flowers will have sprung up, one fair and one ugly. The fair one you must eat, the ugly one you must let stand, but mind you don't forget the last." That was what the beggar wife said. Yes, the queen did what the beggar wife advised her to do. She had the water brought up in 2 pails, washed herself in them, and emptied them under the bed, and lo! When she looked under the bed next morning, there stood 2 flowers. One was ugly and foul, and had black leaves, but the other was so bright and fair and lovely she had never seen its like. So she ate it up at once. But the pretty flower tasted so sweet that she couldn't help herself. She ate the other up too, for she thought, "It can't hurt to help one much either way. I'll be bound." Ugh, when will people learn to actually follow instructions in fairy tales? I swear they never listen. If you've read a fairy tale called The Lindworm, then you'll recognize that the infertile queen in that story goes through the same procedure. The Lindworm, by the way, is basically a story similar to Beauty and the Beast, but with more murder involved. Well, sure enough, after a while, the queen was brought to bed. First of all, she had a girl who had a wooden spoon in her hand and rode upon a goat. Loathly and ugly she was, and the very moment she came into the world, she bawled out, "Mama!" "If I am your mamma," said the queen, "God give me grace to mend my ways." "Oh, don't be sorry," said the girl who rode on the goat, "for one will soon come after me who is better looking." So after a while, the queen had another girl, who was so fair and sweet, no one had ever set eyes on such a lovely child, and with her you may fancy the queen was very well pleased. The elder twin they called Tatterhood, because she was always so ugly and ragged, and because she had a hood which hung about her ears in tatters. The queen could scarce bear to look at her, and the nurses tried to shut her up in a room by herself. But it was all no good. Where the younger twin was, there she must also be, and no one could ever keep them apart. Are we all on the same page with this queen being the worst mother? She would have given anything to have her own children, and when she finally gives birth, she's quick to shun one of her own daughters simply because of their looks? Also, if you're wondering what happened to her foster daughter, we never see her again in this story. So I think it's safe to assume that the queen had no more use for her since she finally got her own biological, prettier daughter. However, I do like to think that the foster girl grew up and lived happily with the beggar's daughter. Interpret that however you want. Thankfully, Tatterhood has grown a sisterly love with the prettier twin. As I mentioned in the previous episode, a loving relationship between siblings of the same gender is very rare, especially if one of them is prettier or uglier than the other. So this is a fantastic break from that trope. In the end, you should love your children, no matter what they look like, so shame on that queen. Well, one Christmas Eve, when they were half grown up, there rose such a frightful noise and clatter of the gallery outside the queen's bower. So Tatterhood asked what it was that dashed and crashed so out in the passage. Something tells me that it's not Santa Claus. "Oh," said the queen, "it isn't worth asking about." But Tatterhood wouldn't give over till she found out all about it, and so the queen told her it was a pack of trolls and witches who had come there to keep Christmas. I do not have this in my notes, but I just thought of this. So, basically, it's Christmas time, and the fact that there are trolls and witches and not Santa Claus outside, it kind of reminds me of, basically, older pagan versions of the holiday, whether it's Yule or any other similar holidays, in which basically this time of the year, with Christmas or Yule or whatever, is basically a time for creatures of the night or whatever to come out during the winter season. I just thought of that at the top of my head. I probably should have done more research on it, but anyway, continuing on with the story. So Tatterhood said she'd just go out and drive them away, and in spite of all they could say, and however much they begged and prayed her to let the trolls alone, she must and would go out to drive the witches off. But she begged the queen to mind and keep all the doors closed shut, so that not one of them came so much as the least bit ajar. Well, I guess now they care enough more about Tatterhood to basically not want her to face this danger, so I guess that's some kind of improvement. Having said this, off she went with her wooden spoon, and began to hunt and sweep away the hags. And all of this while there was such a pother out in the gallery, the like of it was never heard. The whole palace creaked and groaned as if every joint and beam were going to be torn out of its place. Now, how it was, I'm sure I can't tell. But somehow or other, one door did get the least bit ajar. Then her twin sister just peeped out to see how things were going with Tatterhood, and put her head a tiny bit through the opening. But pop! Up came an old witch, and whipped off her head, and stuck a calf's head on her shoulders instead. And so the princess ran back into the room on all fours, and began to moo like a calf. When Tatterhood came back and saw her sister, she scolded them all round, and was very angry because they hadn't kept better watch. and asked them what they thought of their heedlessness now, when her sister was turned into a calf. "But still, I'll see if I can't set her free," she said. Then she asked the king for a ship in full trim, and well fitted with stores, but captain and sailors she wouldn't have. No, she would sail away with her sister all alone, and as there was no holding her back, at last they let her have her own way. She's pretty persistent. Then Tatterhood sailed off and steered her ship right under the land where the witches dwelt. And when she came to the landing place, she told her sister to stay quite still on board the ship. But she herself rode on her goat up to the witch's castle. When she got there, one of the windows in the gallery was open, and there she saw her sister's head hung up on the window frame. So she leapt her goat through the window into the gallery, snapped up the head, and set off with it. After her came the witches to try to get the head again, and they flocked about her as thick as a swarm of bees or a nest of ants. But the goat snorted and puffed and butted with its horns, and Tatterhood beat and banged them about with her wooden spoon, and so the pack of witches had to give it up. So Tatterhood got back to her ship, took the calf's head off her sister, and put her own on again, and then she became a girl as she had been before. After that she sailed a long, long way to a strange king's realm. Can we take a moment to appreciate how badass Tatterhood is? Props to her! Now the king of that land was a widower, and had an only son. So when he saw the strange sail, he sent messengers down to the strand to find out whence it came, and who owned it. But when the king's men came down there, they saw never a living soul on board but Tatterhood. And there she was, riding round and round the deck on her goat at full speed, till her elf locks streamed again in the wind. The folk from the palace were all amazed at this sight, and asked, were there not more on board? Yes, there were. She had a sister with her, said Tatterhood. Her too they wanted to see, but Tatterhood said no. No one shall see her unless the king comes himself, she said. And so she began to gallop about on her goat till the deck thundered again. So when the servants got back to the palace and told what they had seen and heard down at the ship, the king was for setting out at once, that he might see the lassie that rode on the goat. When he got down, Tatterhood led out her sister, and she was so fair and gentle, the king fell head and ears in love with her as he stood. He brought them both back with him to the palace, and wanted to have the sister for his queen. But Tatterhood said, no. Okay. The king couldn't have her in any way, unless the king's son chose to have Tatterhood. Okay, I'm going back to, That you may fancy the prince was very loath to do. Such an ugly hussy as Tatterhood was. Well, screw you, man. But at last the king and all the others in the palace talked him over, and he yielded, giving his word to take her for his queen. But it went sore against the grain, and he was a doleful man. Now they set about the wedding, both with brewing and baking, and when all was ready, they were to go to church. But the prince thought it was the weariest churching he had ever had in all his life. First the king drove off with his bride, and she was so lovely and so grand, all the people stopped to look after her all along the road, and they stared at her till she was out of sight. After them came the prince on horseback by the side of Tatterhood, who trotted along on her goat with her wooden spoon in her fist. And to look at him, it was more like going to a burial than a wedding, and that his own. So sorrowful he seemed, and with never a word to say. Why don't you talk? Asked Tatterhood, when they had ridden a bit. Why, what should I talk about? Answered the prince. Well, you might at least ask me why I ride upon this ugly goat, said Tatterhood. Why do you ride on that ugly goat? Asked the prince. Is it an ugly goat? Why, it's the grandest horse bride ever rode on, answered Tatterhood. And in a trice the goat became a horse, and that the finest prince had ever set eyes on. Then they rode on again a bit, but the prince was just as woeful as before, and couldn't get a word out. So Tatterhood asked him again why he didn't talk. And when the prince answered he didn't know what to talk about, she said, You can at least ask me why I ride with this ugly spoon in my fist. "Why do you ride with that ugly spoon?" asked the prince. "Is it an ugly spoon? Why, it's the loveliest silver wand bride ever bore," said Tatterhood, and in a trice it became a silver wand, so dazzling bright the sunbeams glistened from it. So they rode on another bit, but the prince was just as sorrowful, and said never a word. In a little while, Tatterhood asked him again why he didn't talk, and bade him ask why she wore that ugly gray hood on her head. "Is anyone else sensing a pattern here? Why do you wear that ugly gray hood on your head?" asked the prince. "Is it an ugly hood? Why, it's the brightest golden crown bride ever wore," answered Tatterhood, and it became a crown on the spot. Now they rode on a long while again, and the prince was so woeful that he sat without sound or speech just as before. So as Bride asked him again why he didn't talk, and bade him ask now why her face was so ugly and ashen gray. "Ah," asked the prince, "why is your face so ugly and ashen gray?" "I? Ugly?" said the bride. "You think my sister pretty, but I am 10 times prettier." And lo, when the prince looked at her, she was so lovely, he thought there never was so lovely a woman in all the world. After that, I shouldn't wonder if the prince found his tongue, and no longer rode along hanging down his head. Gee, I wonder what changed his mood. So they drank the bridal cup both deep and long, and after that, both prince and king set out with their brides to the princess's father's palace. And there they had another bridal feast, and drank anew, both deep and long. There was no end to the fun, and if you make haste and run to the king's palace, I dare say you'll find there's still a drop of the bridal ale left for you. That ends the story of Tatterhood. Obviously, the point of this story is showing us that Tatterhood's spunky, adventurous personality more than makes up for not meeting society's expectations of beauty. Yet, that's what she becomes in the end, even more beautiful than her sister. Some of you might possibly wonder if this ending contradicts what the story is about. Personally, I like to think not. In the very beginning, Tatterhood's appearance was clearly the result of her mother eating the ugly flower. Maybe that was what she was meant to look like the whole time, similar to the prince in Beauty and the Beast. Either way, we love Tatterhood for who she is, not what she looks like. I can't say the same for her hubby, though. Oh, sure, it's more convenient for him to marry her since she turned hot. When they take over the kingdom, I really hope she does most of the ruling. Now, on to our second story of ATU 711, Kate Crackernuts. This story was written by Joseph Jacobs in his book, English Fairy Tales. However, Jacobs' source for this story came from a version written by Andrew Lang in a volume 14 edition of Longman magazine. While this story is very similar to Tatterhood, there are just as many differences that make both stories more unique. With that, let's read Joseph Jacobs' Kate Crackernuts. Once upon a time, there was a king and a queen, as in many lands have been. The king had a daughter, Anne, and the queen had one named Kate. But Anne was far bonnier than the queen's daughter, though they loved one another like real sisters. The queen was jealous of the king's daughter being bonnier than her own, and cast about to spoil her beauty. So she took counsel of the henwife, who told her to send the lassie to her next morning fasting. Immediately, the first difference we'll notice is that instead of a biological relation, the two princesses in this version are stepsisters. Yet, like Tatterhood and her twin, they love each other as sisters should, which defies the whole evil, ugly stepsister trope even more. I don't think I've ever read any other fairy tale in which the stepsisters actually like each other. Of course, there might be more out there that I'm completely unaware of, yet it's still very rare. Sure, in Charles Perrault's version of Cinderella, the wicked stepsisters are forgiven, but that happens at the end, after they've been awful through the whole story. Yet while Kate Crackernuts breaks the evil stepsister trope, it still has an evil stepmother, who also happens to be an evil queen. It's a double whammy. One more thing. Jacobs mentions that in Lang's version, both girls are named Kate, so I guess Jacobs named one of them Anne to avoid confusion or something. So next morning early, the queen said to Anne, "Go, my dear, to the hen wife in the glen, and ask her for some eggs." So Anne set out, but as she passed through the kitchen, she saw a crust, and she took and munched it as she went along. When she came to the hen wife's, she asked for eggs, as she had been told to do. The hen wife said to her, "Lift the lid off the pot there and see." The lassie did so, but nothing happened. "Go home to your Minnie and tell her to keep her larder door better locked," said the hen wife. So she went home to the queen and told her what the hen wife had said. The queen knew from this that the lassie had had something to eat, so watched the next morning and sent her away fasting. But the princess saw some country folk picking peas by the roadside, and being very kind, she spoke to them and took a handful of the peas, which she ate by the way. When she came to the hen wife's, she said, "Lift the lid off that pot and you'll see." So Anne lifted the lid, but nothing happened. Then the hen wife was rare angry and said to Anne, "Tell your Minnie the pot won't boil if the fire's away." So Anne went home and told the queen. The third day, the queen goes along with the girl herself to the hen wife. Now, this time, when Anne lifted the lid off the pot, off falls her own pretty head, and on jumps a sheep's head. So the queen was now quite satisfied and went back home. You know how there are certain surgeries or medical procedures that require you not to eat in a certain amount of time before you see the doctor? I feel like this is the same thing, except, with a curse. Her own daughter Kate, however, took a fine linen cloth and wrapped it round her sister's head, and took her by the hand, and they both went out to seek their fortune. They went on, and they went on, and they went on till they came to a castle. Kate knocked at the door, and asked for a night's lodging for herself and a sick sister. They went in and found it was a king's castle, who had 2 sons, and one of them was sickening away to death, and no one could find out what ailed him. And the curious thing was that whoever watched him at night was never seen any more. So the king had offered a peck of silver to anyone who would stop up with him. Now Katie was a very brave girl, so she offered to sit up with him. Till midnight all goes well. As 12 o'clock rings, however, the sick prince rises, dresses himself, and slips downstairs. Kate followed, but he didn't seem to notice her. The prince went to the stable, saddled his horse, called his hound, jumped into the saddle, and Kate leapt lightly up behind him. Away rode the prince and Kate through the greenwood, Kate, as they pass, plucking nuts from the trees and filling her apron with them. They rode on till they came to a green hill. The prince here drew bridle and spoke. "Open, open, green hill, and let the young prince in with his horse and his hound." And Kate added, "And his lady him behind." Immediately, the green hill opened and they passed in. The prince entered a magnificent hall, brightly lighted up, and many beautiful fairies surrounding the prince and led him off to the dance. Meanwhile, Kate, without being noticed, hid herself behind the door. There she sees the prince dancing and dancing and dancing till he could dance no longer and fell upon a couch. Then the fairies would fan him till he could rise again and go on dancing. Not only does Kate Crackernuts belong to the tail type ATU 711, but it also combines with ATU 306, which is known as the Danced Out Shoes. I'm sure many of us will recognize this in stories like the 12 Dancing Princesses. However, unlike the princesses in that story, who seem to enjoy their nightly dancing, the prince in this story seems to be dancing against his will, under a curse. Also, if there's one thing I learned about fairies and folklore, it's that you probably don't want to get involved with their parties. You never know what will happen if you spend too much time dancing in the fairy realm. For all you know, you could end up dancing for a few minutes, but outside of that realm, it's like a billion centuries that pass, and time has already moved forward, and you could turn to dust whenever you leave the fairy realm. But the bottom line is, don't dance with fairies. It could potentially get you into trouble. At last, the cock crew, and the prince made all haste to get on horseback. Kate jumped up behind, and home they rode. When the morning sun rose, they came in and found Kate sitting down by the fire and cracking her nuts. I guess that's why she's called Kate Cracker Nuts. Kate said the prince had a good night, but she would not sit up another night unless she was to get a peck of gold. The second night passed as the first had done. The prince got up at midnight and rode away to the green hill and the fairy ball, and Kate went with him, gathering nuts as they rode through the forest. This time she did not watch the prince, for she knew he would dance and dance and dance. But she sees a fairy baby playing with a wand and overhears one of the fairies say,
3 strokes of that wand will make Kate's sick sister as bonny as ever she was.
So Kate rolled nuts to the fairy baby, and rolled nuts till the baby toddled after the nuts and let fall the wand. And Kate took it up and put it in her apron. And at cock-crow they rode home as before, and the moment Kate got home to her room, she rushed and touched Anne 3 times with the wand, and the nasty sheep's head fell off, and she was her own pretty self again. The third night Kate consented to watch, only if she should marry the sick prince. Sheesh, girl, it's a little too soon, don't you think? Whatever, this is a fairy tale. All went on as on the first 2 nights. This time the fairy baby was playing with a birdie. Kate heard one of the fairies say,
3 bites of that birdie would make the sick prince as well as ever he was.
Kate rolled all the nuts she had to the fairy baby till the birdie was dropped, and Kate put it in her apron. At cock-crow they set off again, but instead of cracking her nuts as she used to do, this time Kate plucked the feathers off and cooked the birdie. Soon there arose a very savory smell. "Oh," said the sick prince, "I wish I had a bite of that birdie." So Kate gave him a bite of the birdie, and he rose up on his elbow. By and by he cried out again, "Oh, if I had another bite of that birdie." So Kate gave him another bite, and he sat up on his bed. Then he said again, "Oh, if only I had a third bite of that birdie." So Kate gave him the third bite, and he rose quite well, dressed himself, and sat down by the fire. And when the folk came in next morning, they found Kate and the young prince cracking nuts together. Aw, that's actually kind of sweet. Much better than Tatterhood's love interest. Meanwhile, his brother had seen Annie and had fallen in love with her, as everybody did who saw her sweet, pretty face. So the sick son married the well sister, and the well son married the sick sister, and they all lived happily and died happily and never drank out of a dry cappy. I don't know what a cappy is. I tried looking it up but got nothing. Either way, that's how Kate Crackernuts ends. Truth be told, I prefer the romance in this story than in Tatterhood. At least Kate doesn't have to change her appearance for the prince to fall for her. Granted, she's not described as ugly like Tatterhood is, just not as beautiful as her sister. Still, even though she's considered the less pretty sister, she wins over the prince's heart by being brave and saving him, while his brother marries Anne. You might have noticed that in both stories, the prettier sisters are less interesting than Tatterhood or Kate. Near the beginning of this episode, I mentioned that there was another story like this one, called Ricky of the Tuft, by Charles Perrault. In this story, the differences between the sisters are taken even further, and unlike the stories we read today, the prettier sister is the main character. When each sister is born, a fairy tells their mother that the ugly daughter will be very intelligent and that the beautiful one will be very stupid. This makes everyone admire the beauty of the pretty princess, but they'll get bored of her stupidity and then turn to the ugly princess for more of an actual conversation. Later on, the prettier princess meets a man named Ricky of the Tuft, the title character, who is very ugly yet magically bestows upon her the gift of intelligence in exchange for her hand in marriage. In turn, she makes him handsome, or rather Charles Perrault hints that he still looks the same but rather looks more handsome in the princess's eyes. The sad thing is that once the prettier sister becomes intelligent, everyone stops paying attention to the ugly twin, now that her sister is both beautiful and witty to talk to. With this, the ugly sister just disappears from the rest of the story. What the heck, Charlie? That's just sad! This is why I prefer the other 2 stories we read today. Tatterhood and Kate Crackernuts might be considered ugly or just not as beautiful as their sisters, but they're the heroes of their own stories who not only save the prettier sisters who don't have too much agency, but also their love interest, at least in Kate's case. With all of that, what can the tales of the beautiful and ugly sisters teach us today? The physical beauty of princesses is still a topic that many people are debating about. And if I can talk seriously for a moment, it honestly pushes my buttons. This is especially true when it comes to the animated princesses of Disney. There are a lot of angry people out there who claim that the Disney princesses are responsible for making girls feel bad about their own bodies, simply because most of these animated characters are designed with small waists, big eyes, and button noses. I swear that last one has gotten a lot of attention recently on TikTok. Are these people so obsessed with the appearances of these princesses to the point where they completely overlook their personalities? What about Cinderella's kindness, Snow White's playfulness, Belle's love of reading, or Ariel's sense of adventure? I assure you, while children might want to play dress up and try to look like the characters at times, it's those positive traits that really get their attention. What kids are paying attention to the size of an animated character's waist or the shape of their nose? Stuff like that is learned from real people, not animated characters. I'll tell you what, I grew up with princesses, not just the ones from Disney, but also with Barbie, Anastasia, the Swan Princess, Fiona from Shrek, literally anything with an animated princess in it. As I became an adult, I started not to like my body, because I had gained weight. I didn't hate my body because of some subliminal message I got just by looking at these animated princesses. I felt like that because of people who said, not implied, but straight up, words from the mouth, said that fat equals ugly. Thankfully, I learned to love my body and stopped caring about losing weight, which ultimately led me to losing weight without me realizing. What I'm trying to say is that maybe instead of getting angry about the design of animated princesses, we should not only focus on their personalities, but also be more inclusive moving forward, which I personally think has been happening lately. I mean, just look at the reboot for She-Ra and the Princesses of Power, a show that I loved, by the way. The princesses on that show have different body types as well as different skin colors, and some of them represent members of the LGBTQ+ community. Even Disney has been more inclusive in their movies. In Encanto, you've got the three Madrigal sisters who all look different from each other, yet are each beautiful in their own way, both on the outside and within. We also have Halle Bailey, a black actress who will be playing Ariel in the live-action remake of The Little Mermaid, even though Ariel was originally white in the animated version. Yes, I do know that for the most part, the Disney princesses have mostly been portrayed as skinny white women, yet obviously that's not the only face of beauty. Just look at other princesses that have appeared recently. There's Moana, there's Raya, soon we're gonna get Asha. Basically, this goes to show that Disney is showing that beauty comes in many different faces. And it's not just with Disney. This could be happening everywhere. In the end, beauty comes in many different forms with all of us. And no matter what, it's who we are on the inside that matters most. Yes, I know that sounds insanely cheesy and cliche, but you know what? It's true. And I hope that people like Tatterhood and Kate Crackernuts can help us realize this. I hope you all enjoyed today's stories. If you did, then please tune in for next time, which will be the final episode for Season 1. It's a big one, so you won't want to miss it. Until next time, my friends, may all your dreams come true, and fare thee well. Mwah! Bye-bye!